I want to introduce our moderator for today. He is Dr. Hari Prasad. Dr. Prasad is an anthropologist, a poet, and a writer.
Today's presentation is based primarily on a deep and meaningful investigation, very engaging, provocative, stimulating, rich with an understanding of an alternate view of history, a reappraisal of Indian history from an Indian intellectual perspective. I refer to the mind-boggling research, analysis, and documentation of two books by Dr. Rajiv Malhotra, our keynote speaker. As an anthropologist of Indian background, born and trained in the West, I initially also misrepresented and misunderestimated India's mountain of contributions to world history, art, and sciences. Instead, I glorified the West as the epicenter of all that is singularly good and outstanding. You can see that I was completely digested and assimilated, but fortunately, recently, have regurgitated. After studying Indian history and philosophy from an Indian perspective, I realized that the shame, the humiliation, the ridicule we suffered for so long should not be sustained any longer. Dr. Malhotra, in Being Different, has consolidated and solidified ideas I've been playing with for many years at grad school. Being Different has changed my entire view of Indian history. A recognition of our universalism will not only affect the 25 million Indians in the diaspora and the 1 billion people of dharmic practices in India, but also all sensible people and intelligent people everywhere. As humans, we can appreciate our differences, yet we can enjoy our commonality. A very daunting task indeed, given the history of wars and hatred in the world. I am absolutely convinced, ladies and gentlemen, that the vast majority of problems facing humanity today are the results of the direct or indirect lack of mutual respect, individually and collectively, not only on the religious front, but also in the political, social, and cultural areas as well. Today's presentation, I believe, is a discussion on the relevance of mutual respect among cultures and religions, as seen particularly from the Indian universalistic perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the distinct honor and privilege of introducing to you our distinguished guest speaker, the author of the book Being Different and Breaking India. Has taken many years to consolidate the facts and the research together. The author, Rajiv Malhotra, is an Indian-American researcher, writer, speaker, and public intellectual on current affairs as they relate to civilizations, cross-cultural encounters, religion, and science. He's a scientist by training and now full-time founder, director of the Infinity Foundation in Princeton, New Jersey. He was previously a senior corporate executive, then a strategic consultant, and finally, an entrepreneur in information technology and media. He also serves as chairman of the board of governors of the Center for Indic Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and as advisor to various organizations. The accolade goes on and on. I should stop there. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rajiv Malhotra.
Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful city, Toronto. It's an honor to be here. Yesterday, we had a very interesting and informative discussion at University of Toronto, thanks to Professor Don Weeb, who organized it. and who's an eminent academic scholar of the study of religions from a scientific perspective, which is very interesting because typically religion is studied from some other kind of perspective, but his pioneering and provocative approaches from a scientific perspective are very interesting to me because of my own scientific background. And I started out as a physicist because I was very interested in Indian philosophy and wanted to understand it from a scientific perspective. So I thought I'll study theoretical physics and quantum physics and all kinds of things like that. And then I came to the United States for a PhD in physics and moved on to computer science and computational mathematical computation and the ideas of what's computable, what's not computable, and what are truths that are linguistically not expressible. Those sort of philosophical things were actually part of the same quest. And then I moved on to more mundane, practical careers, and then about 20 years ago, I had some shifts inside my consciousness and decided to let go of that trajectory and start this. So for almost 20 years, I've been full-time pursuing my passion, which is to understand civilizations, history, philosophy, and from an India-centric, dharmic-centric point of view. We live in a society which is very heavily dominated by Western ideas of history, Western philosophy, Western ideas of religion, aesthetics, morality, family values, things of that sort. And that's because the West has done a very good job of developing such ideas, there's no doubt about it. But there's also a long tradition of Chinese, Confucian thought and on all these topics, and Islamic thought and Indian thought. The reason the Western became universal is because of power, being able to spread it to the colonies through the English language, through control over media, higher education, and things of that sort. And once a critical mass was established for Western paradigms and Western framework, then people in these other countries, especially in India, were very anxious to adopt this Western universalism model because it became a sign of being a very learned person. And so you find, when I go to Delhi and have discussions there, often I find people wondering what's wrong with me. Maybe it's the diaspora, maybe I'm homesick, maybe there's something wrong with me that I want to reclaim my heritage, because they feel why aren't we just getting into Western universalism as a sort of the normal thing. So there is a lot of momentum in favor of Western universalism. And I wanted to reverse the gaze, which is what I'm doing in this book. Take a dharmic view and look at the West and see what the contrasts are and what the differences are. And that's what I'll give you a brief outline about. The book is a product of many streams of my own journey and thought that have come together into this book. Over the past, I would say, 15 years, I speak at a lot of educators' conferences and meetings in the US. And often I'm the featured speaker to talk about India in a multicultural session, Indian culture, Indian civilization in a multicultural environment. And Canada is, of course, a multicultural society, so is United States, and India is probably the ultimate in a multicultural society. So I'm asked to speak, and it's very interesting. I often start my talk by asking the teachers, they're teachers, they're educators, and they should know these things. So I start by asking them, why do you want to teach India in your class? In other words, it's good to know. In marketing, you do a needs analysis before you provide the solution. So you want to find out what's your need. Why do you want to teach India? And I get strange kind of answers. Nowadays, they'll talk about, okay, there's economic power and there's this outsourcing, and so we ought to know that. But in the 90s, people didn't have that answer because that was not going on. And so they would draw a blank, or they would say something like, I have a friend who's Indian, or something of that sort. I've been to, I know somebody who's been there, or I love elephants, or something like that. And so I would start by saying that I want to find out what is there in Western society, in American society, that has some connection with India. And very few would come up. These are teachers. Very few would say that, Columbus discovered America because he's looking for India. And I thought that would be kind of an obvious thing for somebody to say. And then so I would tell them that, so then I would suggest this to them, give them this clue, and say, why do you think Columbus was looking for India? Why was he looking for India? I mean, and then there's another blank. Why was he looking for India? It's kind of, why? Maybe he was just looking for India. But the Queen of Spain, who was one of the wealthiest monarchs at that time, was a sort of venture capitalist, like some Bill Gates type, thinking of new knowledge. And knowledge of navigation, knowledge of how to get to strange places which have a lot of wealth and a lot of trade potential was like intellectual property at that time. It was, what are the routes, how do you get there? So the Queen of Spain, funding these voyages, was looking for a route that would bypass the land route. And the land route had been controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Muslims controlled the land route from China and India on one side to Europe. The trade was very heavy trade of industrial goods. China and India were huge exporters. In fact, as late as 1750, the historians of economics, various books that you see out there, will tell you that India had 25% of the world GDP, and China had about the same amount, maybe a little higher. So these two places had 60-65% of world GDP, and until 1750. And Europe plus North America combined had something like 15 to 20% less than either India or China. So there was a huge prosperity, and what is called spice trade was not something, I mean, people wouldn't spend, go through all this to get some spices, Actually, the trade was in a lot of things. It was textiles, it was steel, and plant medicines, which got classified as spice, but they were plant medicines. In fact, there is a professor in University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, who specializes in Portuguese history, who went to Goa and got some access, government gave him access to old archives of Portuguese documents, Portuguese trade documents, which the Portuguese left behind. And looking at these documents, he was able to construct what the nature of trade had been since Vasco da Gama arrived. What was it that made Portugal so rich, became a world empire, along with Spain, long before England and France became that, It was largely importing Indian goods and reselling them at high prices to Europe. And one of the categories of goods was medicines. A huge amount of Indian medicines, plant medicines, Portugal became the distributor of these to the European countries and made a lot of money on that. So if you look at the reason why Columbus was looking for India, it's because a thriving trade with India, in which India was the net exporter, and the European societies were paying in gold and silver, mainly gold, and it was a huge trade deficit for Europe. This trade was going through the land routes traditionally, back to the Roman times, back to the Greek times. In fact, there are archives in Greece and in Roman history where they're talking about buying steel from India to make swords because the steel was so tough, and other things that they would buy from India. And then when the Ottomans took control of the land route, they blocked it. This trade was blocked. There was a trade barricade, and the Europeans needed a way to reach India which would not go through the land route that the Ottomans, their enemies, controlled. So they went looking for sea routes, and that's how America was found. So you would think that a story like this would be a nice story to position the whole discussion about Columbus and so on, but I found that hardly anybody ever mentioned this. If you look at mathematics, there's now, in the last 15, 20 years, there's been a lot of research on the history of calculus, the history of infinite series, the history of geometry, the history of algebra, and the role of Indian mathematics in bringing that to Europe. In fact, the word algebra is actually al-jabr. Al is the, like, you know, you have the notorious Al-Qaeda and you have Al Jazeera. So Al-Hind is the India, you know, the Al is sort of a prefix. But Al-Jabr was there was a translator with that name who translated Indian texts into Arabic, Indian mathematical texts into Arabic. And then centuries later, these Arabic texts got translated to Latin. So the Europeans thought that they got it from somebody called Al-Jabr. And so this became known as algebra. This is the origin of algebra. The word algebra itself comes from Al-Jabr, attributed to Arabs. But the Arab Al-Jabr himself, in the preface, says that he's translating such and such work from Sanskrit, such and such word from Malayali, and things of that kind. There's a large amount of mathematical knowledge that went via the Persians and Arabs and later reached Europe. The decimal system is one. But very profound things like the infinite series. The Indians understood infinite series, where you have an infinite summation of infinite numbers which have a finite answer. You're going on adding numbers, but the result is a finite number. That kind of an infinite series idea, and the idea of an infinitesimal. So it's not zero and it's not a finite number. It's infinitesimal, and these are important requirements for calculus. So calculus in European history is declared to have just suddenly come out of Newton. Just suddenly one day he just thought of, like the apple falling on his head, some calculus idea sort of came out. But actually now people are, both in India and in England, there are some British historians and some American historians of mathematics who understand these things. So the role of India in civilizing the world has been there for a while, and not just in a few areas. During the Enlightenment period, which is credited for the rise of European thinking and the modern West and so on, people like Hegel were influenced by India quite a lot. The Hegelian thought, German thought, a whole lot of German thought, a whole lot of linguistics emerged out of the study of Panini's grammar. The study of Sanskrit grammar, Panini's grammar, was a requirement in every European university during the 1800s as a prerequisite. If you wanted to get a doctorate in linguistics, you had to first start by studying Sanskrit, and then you could do something else. And most of the intellectuals in Europe in that period were either Indologists, Sanskritists, or knew of the works of other Indologists and Sanskritists. It was a very important part of being an educated person in Europe. From 1800 to 1850, almost every major European university started a center of Indology and Sanskrit studies, and often downsizing Latin and Greek in order to do that, because they felt that there was a huge wealth of knowledge that they could mine out of these texts. And this shaped Germany's identity. The three main countries that were engaged in this were France, England, and Germany, for different reasons. They all had different reasons. And the discovery that Sanskrit is closest to German among the European languages was very good news for the Germans, because Germans lacked a sense of classical identity, ancient identity. They were considered barbarians. They were considered barbarians in Europe, and even in their own textbooks they called their ancestors barbarians. French considered themselves to be the proud inheritors of the Renaissance, of the whole Latin classics and all that, and the English considered their pride to be based on, they were the keepers of the whole British Empire. The Germans had no empire, and they had no sense of classical greatness. So the question of nation building was very important. You cannot build a nation unless there is a whole sense of antiquity, ancestry, greatness, positiveness. So the discovery of Sanskrit was a very big thing, and hence the idea of appropriating Sanskrit and calling it their own heritage, and hence the origin of the Aryan idea that we're the Aryans, and therefore we must have gone to India and brought all this. These happened over several decades, several generations. It happened slowly. And this was not, it was pioneered by Germans who didn't have colonial ambitions. Germans were not doing it to evangelize in India. They were not doing it for that reason. They were not doing it to plunder India. They were doing it to just build their own sense of who we are as Germans. It was only to build their own sense of identity that they were doing this. The British then took these ideas and they used it for colonial purposes. Now, the number of things that came out of this encounter is just so huge. A few books have come out of this. And people tell me that every culture has borrowed from every other culture, so there was also borrowing from Greece, and I tell them, yes, that is true. There was a lot of borrowing from Greece, but that is not denied. That is being acknowledged, that is being respected. In fact, to be a scholar of Greek classics is a sign of being a very intellectual person in the West. But why is the huge contribution from classical Indian thought erased? Why is it a matter of embarrassment or something that the Westerners aren't just as proud of, because they should also claim the Indian heritage as a source of their own civilization as much as the Greek and Roman are claimed to be. Then there is the spread of Indian civilization across Asia through the Buddhists. A very amazing feature. I was serving on the Asian American Commission in New Jersey, and I was chair of the education committee for Asian studies. And one of the standards in the education department is to teach a certain amount of weeks on spread of civilizations. So when you look at the material on the spread of civilizations in the school system, it's all about Western civilization being spread. Western civilization going to Americas, going to Asia, going to Africa, like that. So I propose that we should also talk about non-Western spread of civilization, and in particular Asian civilization, and more particularly Indian civilization. And they said, this is a fantastic idea, we would love to do that, because multiculturalism is politically correct, everybody wants to support that. But they came back and said, we cannot, in all our research and looking around at history books, we cannot find any example of conquest to India. When will the Indian army go and invade, and where was this spread of civilization? Who was the king who went and invaded? And tell us that. We need evidence. So they were stuck on this paradigm that civilization spreads when you conquer. This is stuck on this idea. And so I had to show, according to them, I would have to show some Indian conqueror who went to China or Japan or Cambodia or Thailand or something, some big invader, in order to show that we spread civilization. So it was a very interesting debate to convince them, which I did, that the spread of civilization, language, agriculture, philosophy, spirituality, meditation, all these kinds of things through the Buddhist monks that went, was not because of any army, and it was not forced on those people. And the Indians never tried to impose a governor to extract taxes out of those people, never tried to change their sense of history and rewrite Chinese history and say you all came from India. There was no attempts to distort to genocide their culture and replace it with one's own ideas. It was very respectful. It was with mutual respect. And in fact, the huge export of Indian civilization via the Buddhists was entirely peaceful, and it was pulled from the receiving side. It was not pushed from the exporting side, but the importing side pulled it. The Queen of Cambodia endowed a whole college in Nalanda University so that she could send her brightest students for higher education. So these places in India, the big education centers, Takshashila, Nalanda, and there were 20 others in what is now called Bihar. These were like the Harvards and University of Toronto and Princeton, and they were like those kind of places in that era. People from all over Asia came, brightest students came to learn, bring back the knowledge. So the spread of Indian civilization was done very differently than the spread of Western civilization, and that's why educators have a hard time acknowledging that such a thing even happened, because they're looking for military generals and things like that, which weren't the case. You know, if you look further, you find that today we are told that this business of Indian knowledge workers, doctors and things, you know, scientists and academicians coming to the West is a new trend. A lot of people think it's a new trend. But actually, if you look at the Arab writers in the period like 8th century, 10th century, 12th century, they are talking about, these are Arab writers and Persian writers, they are talking about the presence of Indian knowledge workers in those countries, in the Middle East at that point in time. Indian doctors, Indian astronomers. So the export of Indian knowledge and the export of Indian knowledge workers was going on not only in Asia, in the China, in the Buddhist belt, but also in the Middle East. It was going on. And this is interesting when you talk about multiculturalism and you talk about what has been India's contribution. These are all, as the person introducing me said, these are all kind of flaws in the way history has been taught and history has been recorded. These things need to be corrected, because these things have an impact on the nature of identity and having a level playing field in terms of multiculturalism. And if you have multiculturalism on the assumption that the West has produced everything superior entirely on its own without any inputs from elsewhere, you know, then it's not a level playing field to begin with. Then you're playing by the rules of one player. One team has made the rules, and you have to play by those rules. And often they even appoint the referees, and sometimes they even appoint the players on your side who are supposed to represent you by having proxies and stooges and cronies who will kind of, who being appointed. So this business of leveling of multiculturalism also means leveling the playing field of the paradigms. Which are the paradigms through which we are going to? Which are the methodologies through which we are going to study, and the correction of history and the history of ideas, in particularly, is very important. One of the books I'm writing is on how prominent Christian thinkers in the last 150 years have learned from Hinduism and Buddhism and reimagined and reconfigured Christianity, come up with major new inputs into Christianity that are influenced from Hindu and Buddhist thoughts. Recently there was a very pioneering Jesuit, Ramon Panikkar, from Sri Lanka. His father was Sri Lankan, mother was from Spain, and he was a Jesuit of very high order. He just died, I think, 3-4 years ago. And the New York Times had a front page obituary, so you can tell how important he must have been. And he studied this all his life, studying the Vedas, writing about it, remaining a theologian in Christianity, trying to see what ideas could be brought over to Christianity. But he wasn't the first or last. This is a very active trend. Teilhard de Chardin in the early 20th century studied Ramanuja's Vishishtadvait, wrote about it, brought a lot of equivalence into Christianity. Sagun Brahman, in the margin he says, equals body of Christ. And so then he takes all this idea and maps it. A lot of people in the 1800s, a lot of Christian scholars in the 1800s were looking for equivalences between Hinduism and Christianity in order to do two things. One was to sort of infiltrate into the Hindu society and tell them that really there's no difference if you convert, there's no difference. We have Trinity, they try to map things to make them look similar. And the second reason was to kind of boost Christianity, to show that these ideas already existed. And in more recent times, ideas of feminism, because there's no goddess, so the idea of, there have been attempts to boost Virgin Mary as goddess by taking a lot of ideas of Hindu goddess and saying, okay, Virgin Mary can be made into the goddess. Many other kinds of philosophical inputs have entered Christianity, and I'm writing a whole book on major thinkers who have been the bridge and they've acknowledged it. Raymond Panikkar was not saying that this, he was not sort of out of the sky coming up with these ideas. He was writing on Hinduism, and then he would do a comparison, and then he would write about how Christians may think of it internally in their own terms without referring to Hinduism. So people of this sort were in the middle of discussion with Hindus on one side or Buddhists on one side, and the Orthodox Christian Church, the Vatican or whichever denomination, the church on the other side. And their role was very tricky. They had to, ultimately their audience was the Christian side. But to the Hindus, they had to sort of have a very nice, friendly discussion to make it look non-threatening, mining from the Hindu-Buddhist side and putting it into the Christian side. So this has been going on for a while. And recently, I discovered another fantastic book, which which means I can actually go even further than 150 years. There's a book by a European scholar, a very substantial book. He has studied the influences brought into Christianity from much earlier centuries when Christian scholars, missionaries, went to Japan and studied Buddhism. So a lot of influences, even before the recent centuries, but a lot earlier, influences from Buddhism into Christianity, and that's a fantastic resource book of which takes my work even further back. More recently, we see the New Age movement in the 60s bringing ideas of environmentalism, sustainability, the sacredness of the earth, yoga, meditation, vegetarianism, animal rights, a whole lot of these ideas inspired from the experience that people had of Indian spirituality. So, in one of the things I do is to talk at management schools and also corporate people, and they are looking at Indian models of leadership. And Bhagavad Gita and other texts are becoming popular for teaching in management school now, models of leadership. So the influence of India continues. And as a physicist by training, I've also looked at the influences, the influences on quantum physics, in the sense, not that quantum physics existed in any Indian text, but the philosophical premises of Indian texts made the early pioneers of quantum physics feel comfortable that there is a worldview according to which this weird thing called quantum physics is okay. Whereas according to the prevailing worldview of the West at that time, it was not okay. It was a huge paradox. It troubled Einstein. It troubled a lot of top Western thinkers to try and assimilate quantum physics into their worldview. And nowadays, neuroscience, a lot of cutting-edge research in the West on neuroscience and cognitive science comes from the study of yogis, meditators, Buddhist meditators, and Hindu meditators, and looking at what are their models of meditation, what are their claims of what they're achieving, and then doing functional MRI studies of the brain. That is responsible for a very large amount of the research that is at the cutting edge of this. So, Infinity Foundation started a project to write many, many volumes on history of Indian science and technology and its contributions to the West. In the area of physical, material, technological advancements, we've produced 9 volumes. We have a goal of 20. We'll see how many we can do, but we produce 9 volumes right now. And then we are looking at, we've done many volumes separately from that in cognitive sciences and psychology and things of that sort. And that's a research area of my own to try and get to. So I wanted to give you this background, kind of a bird's eye view of things which I'm turning into large volumes, all of these different things. Just to set the stage that if we are going to talk about multiculturalism, we need to first set the record straight on the amount of contribution unacknowledged that has come from Indian civilization to the world, and assert that claim and be able to debate that and have qualified people who have the background who can argue these things and make it part of school textbooks and make it part of Wikipedia needs to be redone. Encyclopedia Britannica, which won't have any printed edition but only online edition, that also needs to be redone. And college curriculums on these assumptions need to be redone. So if once this is, the ball has been set in motion, I think that it's a snowball effect already, that these kind of trends are there, people are working on these things. It'll take a while, it'll take some generations to really correct all these things. So people who are raised like the person who introduced me on the assumption of everything great coming out of the West, hopefully in the future it will not only just be people of Indian origin who have a more multicultural view of history, but also Europeans themselves, Westerners themselves, because it would be nice to have a humanitarian, a humanist, multicultural view of history, which gives proper credit where it's due to everybody, so that people understand that we've been in this project of evolving humanity for a long time, and there's been trade and ideas going back and forth, and it's nothing. It's not been the monopoly of one civilization. Now, the question that my book, Being Different, addresses, this is all sort of background, but the question my book addresses is, in what way, in what are the ways in which the basic axioms of Dharma are distinct from the basic axioms of Western civilization, and in particular Western religion. And I've tried to do that in order to not because some people get it wrong when they think I'm trying to discourage interaction between cultures. Actually, it's the other way around. When something is distinct and its properties and what is unique about it is understood and appreciated, then the interaction can go on much longer because it's authentic. And you can learn more from it. You can go deeper in understanding it. There is no point in taking inputs from a civilization and putting it away, setting it aside, or destroying it, because then you're limited to one harvest of fruits from the tree. Whereas if you nurture the roots, you'll keep getting harvest year after year. So if the civilization, the source civilization, Indian in this case, is respected, is nurtured, then it will keep producing more ideas and more contributions to world civilization. So actually preserving the distinctiveness is good for all humanity and not just for people of that country. So this is the first thing I want to say, that I'm not on a project which is sort of Indian chauvinism, although it may seem that way, but I feel that the distinctiveness of Africa, the distinctiveness of China, of every culture, has to be respected, and the people of that culture should bring out what is important in that culture's DNA, cultural DNA, if you will, that needs to be preserved. Right now, if a species of animal is going to be extinct, there's an outrage, or a plant is going to be extinct, there's an outrage. But what about if a language is extinct? What about if a religion is going to be extinct? What about if a culture is going to be extinct? There are the laws of genocide do not apply to cultural genocide. And this is very interesting. When they were discussing drafting the laws of genocide, because of the Nazi genocide, Holocaust and all, the original draft had a definition of genocide which included cultural genocide, which means that if you go and not kill people but wipe out their culture, that would be a kind of genocide because you deprive them of their culture. The Western nations didn't like that, because the Western nations do believe that Western universalism is a good thing. But Western universalism can also be the cultural genocide of other cultures. So what you think is universal, because you think it is the ultimate, may be trampling upon and at the expense of other civilizations that need to be digested and reduced and assimilated and put away into a museum. So this book discusses a concept called being digested and argues against it. Being digested is like, a tiger eats a deer and then the deer is digested, there's no more deer left. That's what happens to the deer. What the tiger didn't want is left out. It doesn't take the teeth and the skin and whatnot, and whatever it takes in, it either turns it into its own tiger DNA, and what would not work is excreted and thrown out as waste. So what is useful to the tiger is assimilated, and the tiger becomes stronger tiger, and it's reconstituted as a tiger's flesh and bones and blood and all that, and what is not useful is just wasted. So civilizations have been digested. The pre-Christians, who were called pagans, kind of a pejorative to call them that, but they contributed a lot of things into Christianity, like the Christmas tree, Easter, a whole lot of things, and yet the pagans disappeared. And similarly, the Native Americans contributed so much to Europeans when the Europeans came and assimilated, digested not only their physical land and their gold and all that, but many other things from them. But they perished, and they're basically living in museums or reservations, sitting in reservations, getting drunk and things like that. Similarly, a lot of civilizations of Africa were digested, and today Tibetan civilization is being digested into China. It's a huge thing going on. So this business of civilizations getting digested is troubling me, and the antidote is being different, which means I define something different about my civilization which is not going to be digested, which I will not negotiate with. I will not give that up. So, for instance, certain terms in Sanskrit should not be translated. This is one of the points I'm making in this book. They're non-translatable. I mean, already we have yoga is non-translatable. It's not, yoga is yoga. You don't call it gymnastics or prayer or exercise or something like that. It is what it is, and you force people to learn what that means. So similarly, in this book, in chapter 5, I have listed several terms which I feel are non-translatable, and I've described how they're commonly translated and why that's wrong. What is wrong, when you translate that, you lose something, and you're getting digested into somebody else's framework, and you're losing your selfhood. You're becoming obsolete because you're being digested. So I discuss that, these kind of ideas. Now, there are people who feel that having a separate identity, having a distinct identity, creates tension. I get that a lot. Why do you want to be different? In fact, a lot of publishers and a lot of advisors wrote to me, you should write a book called Being Same, and it will sell much better. Because people are more comfortable being same. So if you write Being Different, you are climbing uphill, you'll have to answer all these questions, why you want to create all this problem. Just write a book, Being Same, and it'll be like, Deepak Chopra or Oprah or something. They'll put it up on their show, and you will sell like hotcakes. And, things are same and things are different, both. You have to appreciate that. An apple has many similarities with an orange. They got vitamin C, and they're round, and they cost, $1 each or 50 cents. They grow on a tree. I mean, they're similar, but they're not the same. A bicycle is similar to a car because they're made of metal, they have wheels, and they drive on a road, and things like that. But they're not the same. So while there are similarities in the different faiths, and while there are similarities in the different civilizations, there are also dissimilarities. And this book is trying to do what most people don't want to do. And therefore I'm writing a book. Otherwise, if everybody else wants to do something, why should I waste my time doing it also? People are doing it already. But people are not talking about difference, and that's why I decided I should talk about difference and specifically focus on difference in order to point out what are the building blocks of a Dharma identity. You cannot have an identity built on features and qualities that are digested into everybody else. There's nothing left to have an identity. So if you say we love everybody, every religion will say, we also love everybody. If you say we believe that truth is one, everybody will say, truth is one, but it's my idea of truth, this one. So you cannot go with these very simple-minded bumper sticker one-liners that many of our gurus and teachers talk about. And I hope later in the Q&A you can ask me more detailed questions, and I'll be happy to answer. I've tried to go deeper and figure out what I think are basic axioms, fundamental axioms of the Dharma systems, which are not digestible easily into the Western systems, which are the pillars of a dharmic worldview, and which are very distinct and bring a contribution to world civilization. So the very common idea, it's a way of life. Well, if you say it's a way of life, everything is a way of life. I mean, the guy who's a drug addict has got a drug addict way of life. And the Taliban got a Taliban way of life. Everybody's got some way of life. So it doesn't really mean anything if you say it's a way of life. There's no living person who doesn't have a way of life. So these kind of very naive, simplistic definitions of defining who we are don't suffice for me. And therefore, I've written, 4 chapters, chapters 2, 3, 4, 5. Each of them focuses on one particular kind of difference, one particular theme of difference, which is very strong, very important. I don't want to be absolutist. I don't want to say that nobody on the Western side is like that. Of course they are. There are many similarities there too. But the differences are prominent. That's what I'm trying to emphasize in these 4 major categories of difference. And the purpose of writing all this is so that out of this book this can serve as the basis of creating a sense of identity, a sense of who are we. Because if these are the building blocks of what makes us distinct, then we should understand it. And the interesting thing is that these differences are not claiming exclusivity in the sense I'm right, therefore you must be wrong. It's saying mutual respect. This is our worldview, but you have a different worldview which may be fine for you, and we respect that. So we're not trying to impose anything on anybody else. And if you have an identity which is exclusivity based, which says that it's got to be my way, and that's the only sanctioned way by God, of course you're going to create violence and you're going to create divisiveness and tension and all of that. But the criteria of difference that I have identified are not of that kind. So I will conclude, and we will take questions later. Thank you very much for listening.
We will take a little break, about 5 or 10 minutes, so you could stretch your legs a little and return, and then there will be a question and answer period. There are pieces of paper over there that will be the mic that you will be using to ask a question. I would like to ask you to be very objective and direct with your questions and no long commentary, please. We don't have the time for that. One announcement I'd like to make is, and that is Dr. Malhotra will be appearing tomorrow at 11 a.m. at the VCC, Viticultural Center, at 4345 14th Avenue, tomorrow at 11 o'clock. So you're invited to be there.